Okay, let's talk about the main Ansible configuration file. It's called ansible.cfg, and in true Unix fashion, the search path looks something like, okay, you're running Ansible or one of the Ansible commands like Ansible Playbook. The first place that Ansible is going to look for a config file is in the Ansible config environment variable. So if you're setting this into, let's say, a shell config so that it's always set with an export statement or something like that, or if you just set it during your shell session and then run Ansible, this will be some path to your main configuration file. The second place it looks is, okay, if Ansible config isn't set in the shell, let's look in the current directory. This is the method that we're going to be using for most of this course. Many people use the top-level Ansible configuration file in etc. That is point number 4 here, but we're just going to use a local one in our main sort of Ansible command center directory. Third place it checks is for a hidden file. Notice that period at the beginning of the file name in the user's home directory. Now the user is whichever user you're running Ansible as. So if you want user-specific Ansible configuration files, you can do that. So again, that would be in home, username, and then a hidden file, so .ansible.cfg. Finally, the most top-level config file, etc ansible ansible.cfg. We'll take a look at that in a second, but for right now, all we're going to enable is host key checking equals false. I'll explain what that means in a second. So we're going to have a single directive here. You'll notice that this is sort of an ini file syntax. It's got this sort of headings, section headings between the brackets, and then key value pairs separated with an equals sign being the actual configuration options. Let's have a quick look at that in practice. So here we've got, we're sitting in my sort of Ansible directory here. This is where I'm going to be doing all my playlists, all my Ansible files, scripts, etc. What we've got here is simply an Ansible CFG file and an inventory file, which we'll get to in the next video. The Ansible CFG file simply contains that one directive that we want, which is to disable host key checking. So host key checking is false. What that means is when I SSH into one of the machines, quote-unquote servers, that I'm going to be managing with Ansible, I don't want SSH to block and prompt for a fingerprint check if I haven't connected to that machine before. That's a security feature of SSH which prevents man-in-the-middle attacks. It basically shows you the machine's fingerprint the first time you connect to it and say, hey, are you sure this is the machine you want to connect to? Because if you're not, someone could be man-in-the-middling you. Now, whatever your security policy at work, forget about that because we're dealing with LXC containers on our very own local machine. So we're just going to go ahead and disable that. And that way, when you spin up a new container or whatever, you don't always have to connect to it once first and accept the host key and add it to your known keys, and you just forget about it. So it just makes life a little bit easier for us. But let's look at that top level Ansible CFG file because it actually contains a fair amount of documentation. So that's an etc Ansible ansible.cfg. You can see that file. All of this is commented out. So you have the section headings like defaults, but these are just ideas. So I recommend you look through this, read through this just a little bit, because it'll kind of explain some of the things that Ansible is thinking about, what it can do, and some of the settings that it might make sense later on to change. A lot of these things can be overridden on a so during command invocation, so if you're just calling Ansible on the command line, like for ad hoc commands, or a lot of these settings can also be overridden inside of playbooks, which is usually where you're going to be overriding things. If you're finding yourself overriding things all the time, it makes sense to put this into an Ansible config file. If you're the only user on the machine, fine, put it in the etc Ansible CFG file, the main system config file. I tend to be conservative, I grew up on multi-user systems, so I tend to either have it in my own home directory or just in the directory, my Ansible working directory. In my example here, it's just the code directory in my home folder and an Ansible course directory. So there you go. That is all you need to know for right now about the main Ansible.cfg file, Ansible config file. In the next video, we're going to look at the host file, which is the other really important one. It's your inventory file where you list the hosts that you're actually going to be managing with Ansible.